With the return of President-elect Bola Tinubu ahead of his inauguration, Nigerians will be looking forward to how he intends to fulfill all campaign promises and the names that will make up his cabinet. Tinubu, while speaking about his plans for the country, said he had been consulting and planning with a view to putting together a strong team so he could hit the ground running after assuming office on May 29. He also urged Nigerians to disregard the rumor about his health, saying he's strong and refreshed enough for the task ahead. So what is the task ahead for the president-elect? One will be repositioning Nigeria's dire economy as the debt profile and inflation levels keep soaring. Joining us on this show right now this morning to discuss what the focus should be for the president-elect Bola Ahmed Tinubu to reposition Nigeria's economy is Tilewa Adebajo, an economist and Chief Executive Officer at the CFG Advisory. Welcome to the morning show. Well, Tili, it's good to have you again on the program. So, Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu is back. He engaged Nigerians with an 88-page manifesto titled Renewed Hope. And a substantial part of that manifesto is devoted to the economy. There have been issues around the economy, inflation, ways and means, your favorite subject, fuel subsidy, and all of this. For you as an economist, what should be his immediate priorities as he assumes office on May 29?
Thank you very much. Good morning, Ruben, and good morning, Rufai, and good morning, Ayo.
Good morning.
I have to continue to remember your name. Anyway, thank you very much. I think Nigeria is at a precipice, I would say, in terms of the economy. But before I say anything, it is important to understand that the Nigerian economy currently is valued at about $1 trillion in GDP output. There's no doubt about that potential. But unfortunately, because of the structural issues we have and the mismanagement of our economy, we're only operating this economy at 40% of capacity, i.e. our GDP is just about $400 billion, instead of being $1 trillion. So the question is that how do we put in place the structural reforms and the policies that will stimulate growth for us to reach that growth potential? At a point, our GDP was almost 600 billion. We've lost 100 billion of our GDP in the last 6 years. If we had gained 100 billion of our GDP would be closing on 800 billion easily. So the biggest challenge Bola Ahmed Tinubu's government faces is the debt profile. Because the question is that all the policies and in the renewed hope agenda from the manifesto, question is that how are you going to finance all those projects and all those programs? Because right now, the government budget for this year is 20 trillion. The revenue is 10 trillion, and you have a deficit of 11 trillion. And you still need to finance that deficit. So you are looking for 11 trillion deficit to fund that economy. So is he going to resort to ways and means to be able to continue to finance the budget for the rest of the year? So his immediate challenge is to run out the budget for this year, set up his economic management team to be able to see the economy through the end of the year, and then prepare his own budget, his initial budget for next 2024, with a renewed economic plan based on that. So the first thing he needs to do is to address how he's going to finance this deficit of 11 trillion. If you remove the subsidy, which is about $15 billion, if you use an exchange rate of 430, you probably still have a shortfall of 4 trillion to finance. So it's not that bad, because with 8 trillion coming from subsidy, you'll be able to reduce that deficit significantly to 4 trillion. If you had used exchange rate of 750, you'd wipe out the deficits with the fuel subsidy. So those are the sort of things that he needs to do. He needs to be able to free himself and find himself funding to be able to support the renewed hope agenda, manifesto, economic policies.
Okay, all right, thanks for setting that tone. Now, when you look at fuel subsidy, which is something that you've talked about a number of times, and that is crucial to the economy in terms of when Bola Ahmed, President-elect, does become president. first of all, body language-wise, and the will to do so. How confident are you that he would? I mean, you're not him, so you cannot definitely speak authoritatively for him, but how confident are you that he would take out fuel subsidy, bearing in mind that it would make him initially very unpopular? And subsequent, previous governments have not been able to carry that out, despite it being part of their campaign promises. And then I wanted to ask you, any suggestions for shoring up our revenue? When we looked at the debt service to revenue profile, the World Bank has a different figure compared to the finance minister. From the finance minister, it said about 80.6%. Let's take that figure. How do we shore up revenue to finance these projects as well as to manage our debt?
Thank you very much. Let me take your first project about political will. That's going to be very important. Yeah. What is important is that Nigeria has the institutions. There are the critical institutions that the president-elect will have to look at is, first of all, the Central Bank of Nigeria. You have to look at the Ministry of Finance, and then you have to take a look at the Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investments. That Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment is a ministry that is somewhat overlooked, but has 18 critical parastatals that can significantly impact trade and investment policy. Right now, there's a misalignment of trade policy, monetary policy, and fiscal policy. So within those three institutions, you need to restructure them, put the right people in place, and you have to have a coordinating person within the presidency, probably the president himself, that will coordinate all these three ministries to be able to deliver the implementation. Because without that, you're not going to have the political will. The laws in Nigeria are adequate in terms of the reform. We just need to stick by them. As you know, the CBN Act has been violated. The Fiscal Responsibility Act has been violated. We need to restore that credibility back into that system. So if he can put all the right structures in place with the right people, I think that that possibility is there. The removal of the subsidy, as we've said, will free up 8 trillion naira that we'll be able to use to reduce the deficits and at least restore confidence to being able to raise money on the markets. And I think the second leg of your question was looking at, please just remind, shoring up the revenues. Yes. Right now, the revenue profile is about 10 trillion naira. And out of that, only 20% is oil related. So that now has to do with your investment and trade policies, tax incentives, concessioning. And there's one critical issue that is most important in an economy, is confidence. If you can restore confidence in any economy, then you will wake up the financial markets, you wake up investors, and they will continue to begin to expand and open up and growth. So growth is key. With confidence in the economy, you can restore growth. We need to repair our international credit rating, which is currently at junk bond status. So we need to also implement structural reforms and show the world that we're serious. Once they see that, then confidence will restore. We can restore our credit ratings abroad, and then that confidence comes in, and then people are not afraid to make investments because they are clear with their economic policies.
So I don't want to be a David Downer. When you keep saying we free up this subsidy money, I think we should tell the people the true picture. The money is not there. It's based on the projected revenue that we might hit or we might not hit. That we say, okay, if you remove it, you will. Because even, how is the subsidy even being funded in the first place? We all see what the NNPC is doing as regards that. And that's why the NNPC is not putting money into the federal revenue purse any longer. So as we speak, the money is not even there in the first place. Secondly, I thought when you were measuring those critical points, you were going to measure the NNPC. Because that's another critical point out of all of this, apart from the work the FIRS is doing now that is bringing some money in, at least we can pay FAC and do some other things. It is the NNPC too that's bringing the bulk of the money in. Doesn't the NNPC need a lot of looking at? And some people have also argued that Mr. Bola Ahmed Tinubu needs his own supplementary budget. That this might not be it for him as we speak. Now, what will you say as regards those arguments?
Let's take a look at your first two questions. It's quite clear that the National Petroleum Corporation has not been remitting funds into the Federation account for the last 2 years. They claim that, I mean, for me, I agree with your point, because oil is $100 a barrel or hit $100 a barrel. And that is the point in time when NNPC says they can't remit, that they're using all that money to fund the subsidy. So if you remove the subsidy, then that money from the oil revenues become available. And depending on the exchange rate you change it, you have money available to you, between 8 to 10 trillion, depending. So that money can be available once you stop the subsidy. On the second side about having a supplementary budget, what the president-elect needs to do is you just can't start it that way. There's a process, because you need to, first of all, put in your economic management team. You need to be able to get the right people, and you need to be able to articulate your policies. So if you articulate your policies properly, then you put an economic plan. And you also have to look at a plan, not only for now, but for the next 4 years. You have to review the medium-term economic framework. That's the most important thing. And then you have to come up with a 4-year implementation plan. Then you can now look at how you can look at a supplementary budget or run this budget till the end of the year. And like I said earlier, your first budget would be preparing the budget for 2024. So that's what your focus needs to be. Within the first 6 months, you need to look at how you're going to stabilize the economy and restore confidence. And then you can now begin to look at how you drew up an economic plan for the next 4 years, and then use the medium-term economic framework process as a benchmark or a process to be able to deliver your first budget in 2024, which will eventually set the tone for what you want to do over the next 4 years. But the first 6 months, you need to be able to stabilize the economy and understand the depth of what the problem is. Because right now you are not sure. It's not until you get there before you know exactly what the real problem is.
Okay. Let me ask you specific questions. There are certain things that bother Nigerians. Some Nigerians say that fuel subsidy is a big issue. The current government is already saying that fuel subsidy will go on May 29. Well,
on or before?
On or before, whatever. Mm-hmm. But they've been saying, Zinabamat, I think that's her name,
yeah.
The Minister of Budget, National Planning and Finance, says, this fuel subsidy must go. So what will you be saying to Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu with regard to fuel subsidy? Considering the fact that this same government, President Buhari, head of the government, had said, look, the PIA should wait with regard to fuel subsidy removal because of consequences. Will you advise Bola Ahmed Tinubu, as he steps into that office, to make his first assignment removal of fuel subsidy? Number two, people have been speculating about the tenure of the CBN governor, Godwin Emefiele. Some people have been saying, in fact, once Tinubu gets there, he's going to remove Emefiele because of all that toing and froing and furore over, redesign of the Naira and the cash crunch that people talk about. And then, okay, maybe we don't have time. Otherwise, I would say, what kind of team would you like to see working for Tinubu? Because already people are jostling up and down, people are positioning themselves, people are taking photographs in Washington, D.C., they are saying they are waiting to control the finances of Nigeria. What would be your recommendations on specific issues, not just broad general issues?
Okay, let's take the subsidy issue first. I think it is clear that we've been on this subsidy matter for over 12 years. And we have seen the consequences of where the subsidy is. I think if we're in doubt as to the consequences of what this subsidy is causing us, because if we don't take this decision, we're going to start heading the way of Venezuela or Zimbabwe. So it is very critical that if the Buhari government removes the subsidy, then let's remove it and let's begin to see the impact on the economy and let's deal with that, because he has 1 or 2 things left with us. Then let's understand when the Dangote refinery is going to come on stream, because that's also very important. Because if you have domestic production, then you wouldn't really have too much of a problem. The problem is subsidies are refineries. How in a situation whereby we're one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world, but we cannot refine our petroleum products. So we need to reverse that, and we need to do something about those refineries. He needs to do that very quickly. As to the tenure of the central bank governor, Definitely, I think the central bank, the Ministry of Finance, and the Ministry of Trade and Investment needs to be repositioned and refocused. I think the central bank has sometimes, I would say, they have, overreached their mandate. And I think the central bank needs to go back to its core functions of monetary policy. As to the removal of the central bank governor, there are processes in law that you need to do to remove a central bank governor. But obviously, it is clear that he can proceed on a terminal leave, and there are ways and means to go about how to put his own team in place. As for the people who are jostling for positions, that's normal. That's what politics is all about. Some people started this process and got involved in politics for the sole purpose of this. But it's up to the president-elect to be able to put round pegs in round holes. Because if you don't do that, we need to move away from mediocrity, and we need to move into a meritocracy. If you put the right people in place, you empower them, and like I've said anyway, the three critical ministries working under the presidency, Ministry of Finance, Central Bank of Nigeria, Ministry of Trade and Investment, working under the presidency in a coordinated manner. The president has to lead the coordination of the economy. With the right people in place, allow them, empower them. You need to strengthen the CBN because that institution has been weakened. It's been politicized. That is why the central bank government will violate the Central Bank Act without any consequences. So that institution has been weakened. So we need to empower and we need to restore the institutional integrity of those three critical institutions. And the presidency needs to empower these people and let them do their job, give them their mandates, and let them deliver on that.
All right. Thank you very much. Yes, in terms of being specific, I thought you would also mention some recommendations from you. I mean, you worked in this space for a while. Perhaps you're trying to move away from actually...
In terms of recommendations?
Yes, I mean, from your expert opinion. We have men like Mr. Wale Edun, who had worked as Commissioner for Finance, who has featured quite prominently.
It's going to be presumptuous to do that. I think what is important is that in Nigeria, we have a lot of qualified people. Mm-hmm. It's not our problem. It's like I said, putting round pegs in round holes and focus on meritocracy. Then you won't have a problem. We don't want, there's a lot of, we don't want political and people who don't have the capacity to do their work anymore. So we need to avoid conflict of interest, because bankers are not supposed to be running a central bank. And that's the conflict of interest we've always had in Nigeria.
You have an issue with bankers running the central bank?
Yeah, it's like the fox guarding the chicken coop. But that is something we don't see in Nigeria.
Okay. How about journalists heading the Central Bank of Nigeria?
It's happened before, you know that.
Oh, yes.
So there's no problem. There's no conflict.
All right.
Give me the Central Bank. I'll run it for you.
I know. Put it out there. Well, let's talk about jobs.
Yes.
Job creation, unemployment figures. We haven't had that in a while, even though they say next month we should get the latest unemployment figures. However, KPMG has gone ahead to give some projections, and the numbers are not looking good. In fact, from now till at least for 2024, where it ends, it's declining. So it's getting worse and worse. This particular government has tried through initiatives and programs to create more jobs. In fact, you recall they had promised, I think, 3 million jobs per annum. So they haven't quite, even though they might say they've done this and done that, we haven't seen it. The numbers and the figures are worse. In terms of the next administration, what are some programs? What are the easy or quick fixes in that area? Because we have a job crisis on our hands. We have young people who are either unemployed or underemployed. How do we begin to solve that problem?
Well, let me also add to the job. That's one of the saddest part of what's happening here, because like I've said, that's where you have a $1 trillion economy
yes,
that is underperforming because productivity, your youth and your human capacity is there. And let me add to that 130 million people are also in poverty. So what is important with job creation is that you need to grow the economy. There are magic things that you need to do. Once your economy is growing between 7.5 to 10% per annum, you will solve the poverty and you'll solve the job creation problem. So what you need to do is to employ the growth strategies. Structural reforms are very important. You need to let go of all these airports, concessioning of infrastructure, privatization of assets, and open up the economy so that all these economies, all these structures can begin to generate jobs. Government does not need to be running airports and so many other things. Let them offload it and begin to focus on social infrastructure, i.e. healthcare and education. So growth, economic growth will deliver the jobs and alleviate poverty.
So are you recommending more privatization, especially for, like you mentioned, airports or concessions?
Privatization and concessioning.
Okay.
Very important. We need to move in that way.
So what do we do about this dire straits we are in? Because what Nigeria has now is what I call the holy grail of disaster. High inflation, high unemployment, economic stagnation. Holy grail of disaster.
It's called stagflation.
Stagflation.
Yes.
So how do we resolve all of this? Because you keep talking about structural reform. Invariably what you are saying is political will. That's structural reform, which we lack. Because we all know what to do, but it is the political will and the cronies' interest that, that dampens the prospect of growth that really matters. It's not that we all not know the problem of Nigeria. Like Nnamdi Azikiwe said, we suffer from what we call analysis paralysis. We all know. But the political will to be able to get all of this on the road. Has Nigeria fallen so deep enough to wake the political racketeers up from their slumber?
Very interesting question, Rufai. I wish I knew most of these people, but I think what you are saying is the fact that, for instance, Nigeria does not have any functional refineries now. And we're one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. That is a travesty, and there's so many ironies you see of Nigeria. And again, like I've said, if all those things were in place, you would have a $1 trillion economy. And it's because these things are not in place that we're shortchanging ourselves. So it is important that we see not only the renewal of hope agenda we've seen in the political manifesto. It's time to translate that into economic growth for the benefit of Nigerians. It's not rocket science. We don't have to wait for the World Bank or the IMF to do that. We have capable people in this system. And like you said, if we reform our institutions, all the laws are in place in Nigeria, reform these institutions, refocus these institutions. I've named 3: Central Bank of Nigeria, Ministry of Finance, and Ministry of Trade, Industry and Investment. You need to get a realignment with not only your monetary policy, your fiscal policy, but also your trade and investment policy. Right now, our foreign direct investment is less than 1 trillion. What is saving this economy is that Nigeria still remains the startup capital of the world, and a lot of money from venture capital is still pouring into this country for startups in billions. And despite or in spite of a lot of all these, what I would call the underperformance of capacity, Nigeria still remains the largest economy in Africa.
Okay, let's talk about debt.
Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned...
Let me escape from this.
You mentioned 11 trillion. We're told it's as high as 77 trillion.
That's the deficit from this year's budget alone.
Yes, from this year's budget alone.
Yes.
Which the next government is going to inherit. But some Nigerians, civil society groups, they were in Washington, D.C. at the spring meeting of the Bretton Woods institutions. And one of the points they went there to make, I think, Awal Raspanjani, I think he was there, he was quoted in the papers, is that IMF World Bank should not give Nigeria any loan, that we have had enough. Is it possible that this country can survive without borrowing more? Because I recall the Minister of Finance saying the way forward is for us to borrow more. The Debt Management Office also says, if you look at the margin, in fact, we are not borrowing enough, we should borrow more, so that in 40 years' time, our grandchildren will still be paying debt.
Well, let me be unequivocal about what I'm saying now. Nigeria can no longer sustain this debt profile. Okay, the official debt profile now is about maybe $100 billion, $103 billion. But if you add all the other ways and means and all the other financing that is not on the books, our total debt profile is close to $200 billion. Okay, so now, debt to GDP is not the way forward. America's debt to GDP ratio is over 101%. Our debt to GDP ratio is in the area of 40%. But the difference is that the Americans and most industrial countries spend 8% or single-digit numbers to service their debt. In Nigeria, 96% of our revenues goes towards our debt service. That is where the problem is. And you can no longer continue to finance a deficit economy except you want to go the way of Venezuela or Zimbabwe. So there's no doubt about that we can no longer afford to service or sustain this debt, or Zambia.
That is tied to China.
So that's the direction we're heading if we do not make the right choices. So the World Bank we have hit our debt limits everywhere. Our external borrowing cannot go anywhere because our international credit rating is at junk bond status. The only viable means for us for funding now is Ways and Means, and that's why they're going there, which is illegal. So we need to restructure our debt right now, internally, before we are compelled to do so by the Paris and London club debtors, as to what's happening in Ghana now. You can see that a lot of Nigerian banks have taken a haircut on their investment in Ghanaian bonds as a result of the default of the Ghanaian government. So it's important that we come in here and do an internal debt restructuring as a matter of urgency before the international communities and the London and Paris Club compel us to do that, so that we can put our economy on a sound footing. The debt levels now in Nigeria are clearly unsustainable.
Okay, well, when speaking to the NESG, presenting his economic plan, the president-elect had talked about debt. In fact, he had compared the Japan story, saying that debt is not necessarily a bad thing. So it was just his management of debt and what the money would go to, would be used for. I wanted to talk about your aspect with regards to monetary policy and fiscal policy, which you also touched on, saying that his response to inflation in particular would not just be a monetary policy, but focusing more on fiscal policy. I say this because we talked about the fact that at the joint meeting of the World Bank and IMF, they had recommended raising basis points even more, so raising taxes in Nigeria to interest rates to tackle inflation. What's your stance on this in terms of more to continue to raise interest rates to tackle inflation, or perhaps focus more on the fiscal side of things? And if that's your position, I'm preempting now, what would be some of your immediate recommendations? Because that is one of the big challenges of the next administration.
Well, I've talked about debt restructuring.
Yes.
And I've put proposals forward on how to restructure this Ways and Means financing, because it's very important. Because the federal government of Nigeria is insolvent. Okay, because the only reason why the government is standing is because it's a sovereign. There's no bank. If you remove federal government of Nigeria from the balance sheet of Nigeria, there's no bank in Nigeria that will give you money. There's no bank in Nigeria that will give you money when you're using 96% of your revenues to service debt. In our own households, we cannot use 96% of our revenues to service debt because we can't continue to borrow to pay salaries over the last 6 years. It's not sustainable. So we need to realize that. So we need to restructure that debt internally. And I think debt restructuring is something that we can sit down, we can negotiate and put the structures in place. Number two, you have to take a look at, I talk about there's a misalignment with monetary, fiscal, and trade and investment policy. So if you want to grow your economy, which is important to be able to move out of poverty and create the jobs you're talking about, you cannot have interest rates at 18 to 20%. So most of the bank prime lending rates now are close to 30%. You can't borrow at that rate to survive. And government is borrowing money and crowding out the private sector. So how do you grow the economy? So you need to be able to restructure your interest rates regime. And the biggest problem now is inflation. If you tame inflation, then you'll be able to drop your rates. So it's important that and what is causing inflation is Ways and Means financing. So it is important that you address that. And this CRR that the central bank has at 32.5% means that for every 100 naira we deposit in the bank, the central bank takes 32 naira to be able to fund ways and means, which is crowding out the economy and restricting growth. So we need to unlock all those issues and restructure and put this thing on a viable path.
So let me take you back historically. So a lot of people say we've been taken back to where we were around the sweet spot of 1993, 94, where interest rate was about 40% and the inflation was well over 50%. If those numbers were anything to go by, the economy was in dire straits until we had to navigate our way through and we started having soft landings in the early 2000s. So, three things will be number one. How do we increase revenue? Isn't it sad for an economy that you said potentially should be 1 trillion, cannot even make $100 billion in revenue? Isn't it sad? Isn't it? And that's why I asked the question, are these political gladiators even ready to see it? Because you see, I think it was somebody that was speaking and they told him the dire strait of the Nigerian economy, and he said, don't worry, we can still print money. And that's the mindset of people we're dealing with in this country, in the leadership. So how can we at least get to 60 to $100 billion revenue? That's my number one question. Number two, you talked about inflation, really because of what the CBN is doing, with printing more money, ways and means. But some people also argue that inflation is largely structural and legacy. When you check the inflation numbers, food inflation is on the rise. Why? Because farmers in Birnin Gwari, in Kaduna, can't go to the farm because of insurgency and banditry activities. Zabamari is there. All the food belts of Nigeria are not functioning at optimum capacity. Yam and tomato go to waste because people are being killed in Benue. All of that is there. Secondly, I think it was Amartya Sen that wrote in his book, that it's development that brings freedom and peace. How can we bring about a cushioning to that insecurity effect that can at least jack up food production and reduce the burden on this food inflation we're facing?
Thank you very much. First of all, low-hanging fruits, NNPC. You need to restructure NNPC. You need to refocus NNPC in terms of oil production, make the necessary investments, resolve the insecurity problems that are leading to oil theft, and that will give you your bread and butter revenue that we have. The Nigerian economy itself is very well diversified. And if you look at the budget this year, NLNG is bringing good income for us. So why haven't we invested in Olokola LNG and Brass LNG? Most of those two projects reached final investment decision, but we've not had the will to do that. So if you do not make the investments, you cannot expect the return. So we need to restructure an NPC, make sure that we can optimize our oil revenues, and then begin to make investments in the two other LNG projects. That will stabilize that. Then the tax base. This is somewhere where we've made a lot of progress. If you are growing your economy, and the economy is growing, your tax revenues will follow. So the key you need to do is to focus on growth. And when you understand your growth drivers and put in the right structures in place, then you will not have that problem. And like I said, another thing that we take for granted is confidence. When there was confidence in this economy, banks were giving loans to staff of work, to everybody. We created a middle class. You could get a consumer loan to buy a car, to get a mortgage. You could buy household products. And so what has happened? That is because
and this was 8 years ago.
Yes.
This was 8 years ago, for Christ's sake.
That was confidence. So once you restore confidence in the economy, things will begin to happen. Then your foreign exchange regime, for crying out loud. Multiple exchange windows. We've been talking about this for 8 years. Nothing has happened. Diaspora remittances are between 25 to 80 billion US dollars a year. That money is coming out in an uncoordinated manner. You've seen now, if you want to apply for BTA or PTA, there's a portal. Create another portal where diaspora remittances can come directly into the banking system. So you can, if you have your cousin in America that wants to send you $500 or $1,000, let him send it straight to your account. If you capture this money within the system, you will bring in dollars into the system officially. And if you now pack your dollars together, you can now use it to buy your PTA and do your Form A transactions. And if you have all these small traders, you can now amass your money and with the same portal, use it to open your LC and conduct Form A transactions. This will reduce pressure on the Naira. But you have $30 billion coming from offshore in an uncoordinated manner. You need to trap it in the system. Give people confidence to use the domiciliary accounts. That in itself will help significantly. The margin between the official exchange rates and the parallel market is now 75%. We have seen a 350 devaluation in our currency in the last 6 years. Where does that happen? And nobody's saying anything. So these are the sort of things that we need to change. You know, if we make these basic changes, we will see significant benefits.
The insecurity, I said, that really increases the inflation number, because when you look at the inflation trajectory, food inflation takes a big spike out of all of this.
Yeah, we're aware of food inflation, and insecurity is related to food inflation. We know that. And so we've had a president who was supposed to be a general, who was supposed to have all the answers. But again, what has happened? And another thing I think is important that this government needs to do is that they need to set up a monitoring and implementation, independent monitoring and implementation team that will help monitor and document what has been done. Because if you take a look at the last 8 years, you cannot say that this is what has been done. Because if I take a look at the numbers and just put it together, what has happened between 2015 and 2018, I'll be very unfair to this government.
Okay, we've been talking about the presidency. Tinubu, what will he do? What will be his economic plan? But we're going to have a major transition, even if it is from APC to APC across the states, at least in more than 24 states of the Federation. What will you say about the cost of governance? We've talked about debt. Already we've seen people hanging around, you know, National Assembly, we should go to this region. How about cost of governance? Do you think that addressing that could be one of the pathways going forward?
Definitely. We have the Onosanye report. Let us dust it up, update it, review it, and implement it. Right now, there's a 40%, they've started a 40% increase in salaries. Salaries are about 5.2 trillion. You had 40% increase.
720,000 people?
Yeah, 5.2 trillion. So that's the salary. It's gone up 80% in the last 4 years and another 40% now. So you talk about the size of governance, but guess what? We have been borrowing to pay salaries for the last 6 years. We have not been paying salaries from revenues. We've been borrowing to pay salaries, and we've not been able to meet our capital expenditure. Then you have your statutory allocations that to the judiciary, the National Assembly, and some designated agencies. How do you continue to sustain that if you do not look at the cost of governance? So at the end of the day, reality sinks in. So that is why by removing the fuel subsidy, 15 billion, and enhancing NNPC revenue, at least you can shrink the deficit to about 4 trillion. If you make the foreign exchange rates adjustments, by removing the subsidy, you can actually wipe out this year's deficit. So we're at a critical stage. The cost of governance, as you've talked about, is 5.2 trillion. And when you take a look at the whole essence of what government is consuming to run government, it's a large chunk of the budget.
All right, okay, so on a final note, the president-elect, agreeing with you in what you've submitted this morning, has talked about the fact that to drive the economy, the private sector must be, must play a critical role in this. Earlier on, we had spoken during the Africa Business Update about the pressure on private organizations, the cost of doing business, the fact that a number of them are either closing shop or even for those who have come into Nigeria. How would you rate the environment for doing business, and how can we make it better for the private sector to thrive in Nigeria?
It's very easy. You have to create an enabling environment. It's not very difficult. We've done it before. It's not the first time. We've seen what happened when we privatized the telecom sector. Companies that came into Nigeria expanded the economy, created jobs. We've seen what happened when we privatized the banking sector. There was a time that when you used to go to the banks, they would give you a tally number. Now you don't need to go to the bank. You use your phone to do your transactions. If we kept these institutions as government institutions, we won't have the growth we've seen today. So if, like you said, if you create the enabling environment and you boost confidence, the private sector is a partner. Government doesn't have all the money. And government cannot run a lot of all these institutions and does not need to. But if you create the right environment, the private sector will make the investments. We're still talking about a national carrier. We've not been able to get it off the ground. What is the government still doing? We don't have a transmission grid that is viable. Why can't you let the private sector make the investments to get the power sector up and running?
No, but they'll tell you that for security reasons.
There's no security issues here. It's practical. So there are many things that the private sector can do to be able to help. If you create the right environment, people will bring in their money.
Yes.
And because you don't have money anyway, you need the private sector, and you need to encourage them through privatizations, through concessions, and through even policy. We have one of the best foreign direct investment policies in Nigeria. There are all kinds of incentives for bringing in new investment into Nigeria. There are all kinds of tax holidays for pioneer status. So in terms of our laws, everything is there. It now requires the leadership and the focus to provide the confidence that will drive the economy, because driving the economy is about leadership.
Right.
And if we have the right leadership in place that is standing in front and pushing it through, and also commitment. You need to be consistent, not just say something and then back away from it 3 months later and make a U-turn. We need to see consistency of purpose. If you do that, people will follow and they will open up.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mr. Tilewa Adebajo, CFG Advisory. It's been great talking to you this morning.